War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 10, Fires in Land Warfare. This episode brings to a close our four-part introduction to ground combat. There are dozens of key terms to understand about firepower that will be introduced as we all too briefly discuss the relatively dispassionate science of fires. Fires exist so that one may damage their opponent without incurring damage themselves. Back to standoff. The most famous example is David and Goliath. The giant was slain by a rock, thrown by a boy, using a sling, and some would argue, not a small amount of help from the Almighty. There's a saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. This saying is wrong, but anyone who's been in actual combat will, at the very least, acknowledge the role of luck. Lucky or blessed, the Bible has a lesson in fires. The initial fires were designed to counter and harass, degrade, or simply annoy infantry, slingers, and simple bowmen. In Greek warfare, you had the peltists, hence the term to be pelted, mostly untrained and unarmored, defended by the heavily armored with shields, body armor, helmets, and their long pikes, well-trained hoplites. The peltists would run up, let loose their missiles, here roughly defined as any object thrown, slung, or in other ways fired. Here we must also separate the terms heavy and light, both in terms of infantry, and we will replace the awkward but more expansive term fires with artillery. Light infantry with the emphasis of high levels of mobility while sacrificing raw power, effectively incapable of static defense, the peltists, and the heavy infantry, strong, powerful, immobile, but capable of both offense and defense. Light artillery likewise sacrifices firepower for mobility, and heavy artillery swinging towards greater firepower, but at the cost of mobility. And as always, another term crops up which must be defined. Firepower is the total amount of force derived from the weapon. Through a combination of range, power of its projectile, and speed of reloading, a weapon's firepower is roughly judged. Firepower is limited by the size of the weapon, the size of the ammunition, the strength and mobility of whatever carries those two components, whether man, beast, or machine, and the speed of reloading. As with all things in combat, compromises are made in balancing these conflicting limitations. Before the advent of armor, simple bows were remarkably effective weapons, and evidence of them date back around 14,000 years. While rarely initially lethal, they could disable an opponent, making them incapable of continued fighting, so the wounded could attempt to flee or be cut down at the leisure of his enemy. As armor was improved and shields introduced, the primacy of the bow was replaced with the heavy infantry. But the light infantry could always avoid battle with the heavy infantry, but could not hold ground against the latter. As villages gave way to cities with their surrounding crops, and thus the need to defend them, terrain-based objectives became more critical, and so too the heavy infantry. Walls provided protection against the heavy infantry, but left the surrounding countryside and their critical crops and farmers helpless unless other heavy infantry could intercede and defend. The clash of phalanxes. The Spartans were the masters of the phalanx, heavily armed, well-trained, strongly disciplined. They were unstoppable. In a fascinating battle which, I promise, will be its own episode, the Battle of, and here I will mangle it, Sphacteria, the Spartan hoplites surrendered, largely untouched, by several factors, not the least of which was the Athenian archers. When the Spartans advanced, the archers would fire off their arrows on the flanks of the phalanx. Enraged, the Spartans would charge the archers who, of course, ran away. Time and again this was repeated, until the Spartans retreated to a position of defense, until they were surrounded and helpless. They had no artillery, they had no mobility, and were forced to surrender. So much for Heraclitus. Prior to this battle, the Spartans saw no need for archers and disdained what they considered the womanly peltists, but in the years that followed, even the Spartans bowed their heads and embraced the combined arms. The Greek-era peltists were not merely bowmen. They could throw small javelins or darts, standard javelins, and some were even slingers, still using David's preferred weapon. The The walled cities provided a challenge, and firebombs were used, slung or thrown to burn down wooden walls or the wooden buildings behind them, the earliest origin of the term fires. The Greeks invented few of these, but their expansive writing provides the basis of our education on them. I will focus on the Western armies in this introduction, not because they were the best or first, but because they provide the examples needed for understanding. This is a doctrinal discussion, not a history lesson per se. As such, we will progress to the Romans, who fully incorporated archers, both on foot and mounted, into their armies as supporting arms to the legions. The Roman bow was a composite made of wood, bone, and sometimes metal, giving them an almost 500-foot range. The use of bows on horseback was after being introduced to the concept by Eastern armies who combined fires in the form of bows and maneuver in the form of horses to great tactical effect. But the Romans dominated as an empire because their heavy infantry, the legion, remained the finest force to take and hold land. The Greeks and later Romans greatly advanced the technology of siegecraft to break down the walls of defending cities using siege artillery, such as catapults, battering rams, and giant crossbows. Here, the emphasis was on the projectile being large or powerful, while sacrificing range and or rapidity of fire. The battering ram being an extreme example of very little range, but great power, and the catapult being a balance from the giant crossbow or ballista. Ranges from 5 feet to hundreds of feet being the general range. These types of artillery were known as siege engines, and they could take days or weeks to assemble, and several minutes to hours to fire. Obviously worthless in anything but static warfare, they were considered the realm of specialists, engineers, to manufacture and use. An advantage of bows and catapults was their ability to use what is called high-angle fire. Any launched weapon will have a maximum range when fired at 45 degrees. If fired at a lower angle, they are generally more accurate, but when fired at a higher angle, they can shoot over defensive walls. To get high-angle fire, you must, of course, be closer to the enemy than if using the optimum 45 degrees. The combination of light artillery in the form of archers, cavalry, heavy siege artillery, disciplined formations of heavy infantry, reached an apex for several centuries with the Roman Empire. But by the 8th century, the ubiquitous use of stirrups matched with saddles had allowed heavily armored knights to become almost impervious to the now poorly disciplined and trained levies of peasants comprising normal armies. These knights were expensive to train, equip, and maintain, and stronger nations were able to gain greater and greater strength. France, for several centuries from the Battle of Tours to the Battle of Agincourt, reigned supreme with their feudalistic system of raising armies of knights. It was the English bow and their trained bowmen which brought an end to the dominance of the armored knight. The English bow was a fantastic source of firepower, combining range, rate of fire, and power, which penetrated the French armor far enough away from the lines of archers protected by pikemen that they wore down the cavaliers to the point where they were combat ineffective before ever reaching the English lines. The infantry and cavalry serving to protect the decisive arm of artillery for a significant period of time. There was a swing back and forth between artillery being decisive and maneuver being decisive, based upon terrain, logistics, and technologies. Many great powers have failed to acknowledge when this swing occurs and have suffered because of it. While the French had crossbowmen and their own archers, they proved ineffective due to the superior range and rapidity of fire of the English longbow, firepower superiority. They had the standoff and won what has been called the artillery duel. When artillery reigns supreme, the initial fight is between the two sides, artillery to gain dominance, the fire superiority gained by some combination of the factors of firepower. With the advent of gunpowder, the concept of fires was almost supreme. Infantry had fires and obviously the artillery as well. Cannons supplanted bows in the long-distance fight, and muskets and later rifles equipped with bayonets replaced swords, pikes, and lances. But the fundamental lessons remained. Large, powerful, but slow-firing heavy artillery of cannons and mortars, a mortar being a short-range artillery piece designed for only high-angle fire, providing siege capabilities, while lighter field artillery providing the mobile firepower to break up concentrations of infantry on the more fluid battlefield. Coastal artillery, designed to defend against ships, was entirely immobile, but their massive size and prepared defenses provided the firepower needed to sink the heaviest ships. Up until the very end of the 19th century, all these parties were present on the battlefield and in full view of the enemy, if during a siege, perhaps hidden behind defenses. But soon, the advent of modern recoil devices, smokeless powder, and self-contained artillery shells allowed for the creation of long-range artillery, which could fire for miles and had the ultimate in standoff. This was the advent of indirect fire, shooting at an enemy you can't see and can't see you. In order for this to be effective, however, you needed to communicate to a spotter who could see the enemy and could tell you how to adjust your fires. Coinciding in this rapid advance in technology was the communications technology of telegraph, telephone, and radio. And while modern artillery could do direct fire, it was designed and optimized for indirect. And now artillery is defined as indirect fire, and cavalry, or armored forces, and infantry were direct fire combat arms. Firepower was multiplying at almost exponential rates. Artillery could fire over 10 rounds a minute for brief periods. Single-shot muskets and rifles saw the introduction of the Gatling gun, whose huge size and massive firepower saw it used and thought of as an artillery piece. Generals of the time divided artillery and infantry by firepower, when the true breakthrough of thinking was understanding it was direct fire and indirect fire. So when the far more mobile Maxim machine gun replaced the Gatling gun, they were employed as separate units more akin to artillery units than supporting infantry weapons. But by the end of World War I, this thinking had been corrected, and lighter machine guns, sometimes called automatic rifles, were assigned down to the squad level. Generally speaking, a machine gun is a weapon that has a crew of 2 or 3 people, and an automatic rifle is assigned to an individual, though the mechanism of fire remains the same. So to bring this back to earlier episodes, when the ability to maneuver has ended for whatever reason, as in World War I, the artillery becomes the dominant arm, each side attempting to pummel the other into either surrender or weakening it to the point that an attack against the weakened point can become successful. This was the case in the Korean War and is the case now in Ukraine. It becomes a battle of trenches and defense, and who can manufacture more artillery shells, who can fire deeper into the enemy lines and with greater standoff. Today, usually found with missiles and rockets, as is happening again in Ukraine as well as Israel. For a quick clarification, a rocket is generally defined as being aimed and fired, but not controlled while in flight, whereas a missile, after firing, can adjust its point of impact literally on the fly. Missiles are far more expensive, but obviously more effective if the enemy can be clearly identified. In Gaza, Hamas is firing rockets at population centers, while Israel is firing missiles at specific buildings. There are those who think fires are superior to maneuver, for only fires can destroy, while others profess that maneuver is supreme, that less firepower, maneuvered and directed against a weak point of the enemy, is the greater psychological advantage to breaking the will of the enemy and its commander. The truth is both can reign supreme at different times in a war or in a battle, and an effective commander recognizes the ebb and flow of combat requires an ebb and flow in the primacy between the maneuver force and the artillery force. With that all too brief introduction to both fires and the greater concept of ground combat, we can now finally move on. Of course, let me know which critical component of land combat in general, or fires in particular, I invariably missed. And please, join me next week when we introduce the concept of sea power. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.